They paid him to guard a captured savage Apache woman. But when he saw her, he knew he had to set her free. Some men take jobs because they need the money. Others take them because they've got nothing left to lose. Silas Crane fell into both categories the morning he rode into that canyon, his pockets empty and his conscience quieter than it had been in years. The man who hired him said, 3 days. 3 days of watching a cage. 3 days of easy money that would save what little remained of his failing life. What Silas didn't know was that some cages don't just hold prisoners, they hold mirrors. And what he would see reflected back at him would force him to choose between the man he'd become and the man he used to be. The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels, their layered stone faces weathered by winds that had blown long before any of this mattered. Silas guided his horse through the narrow passage, the animal's hooves crunching against loose rock that cascaded down in small avalanches of dust. The air tasted like copper and heat. Somewhere above, a hawk circled, watching. Garrett Hollis stood near a crude iron cage that looked absurdly out of place against the natural beauty of the canyon. He was a thick man with hands like butcher's tools and eyes that never quite settled on anything for long. 3 other men lingered nearby, leaning against the stone walls with the casual posture of people who did terrible things for money and slept soundly afterward. "You're late," Garrett said, not looking up from a knife he was sharpening against a wet stone. Silas dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Trail took longer than expected. Trail always does. Garrett finally looked up, squinting against the midday sun that poured into the canyon like molten gold. "You understand a job?" "You said watch the cage. You said 3 days. You said $200. Silas kept his voice flat, businesslike. He'd learned a long time ago that showing interest in the details of a job only invited complications. "That's right." Garrett stood, sliding the knife into his belt. "She arrives in about an hour. My boys and I got business elsewhere. We'll be back before sundown tomorrow to move her. All you got to do is make sure she stays put and breathing. Think you can handle that?" Silas glanced at the cage. It was barely 6 feet on each side, built from iron bars that must have been hauled here piece by piece. Someone had gone to considerable trouble. "What did she do?" Garrett's smile was ugly. "Does it matter?" "It shouldn't have." Silas had stopped asking questions like that years ago, back when questions still had answers that could change things. Now, questions were just noise, complications that got between a man and his pay. He'd guarded worse. He'd done worse. "Guess not," Silas said. "Smart." Garrett motioned to one of his men who brought over a canteen and a small sack of provisions. "Water's scarce out here, but there's enough for you and her. Don't be generous." "And Crane." Garrett's voice dropped lower. "She don't speak English, so don't bother trying to talk to her. And even if she did, you wouldn't want to hear what she's got to say. These Apache women, they got a way of getting into a man's head, turning things around, making you forget why you're here." Silas took the canteen without comment. He'd heard warnings like that before, usually from men who were trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. Garrett and his men mounted their horses with practiced efficiency. Before they left, Garrett turned back one last time. "One more thing. She tries to run. She tries to fight. You stop her. I don't care how, but she needs to be alive and unmarked when we get back. She's worth more that way. Worth more." The words hung in the air like smoke after the men rode out, their horses kicking up dust that drifted slowly back to earth. Silas stood alone in the canyon with an empty cage and a job he was already beginning to regret. The sun climbed higher. The hawk continued its endless circles, and Silas waited, trying not to think about what worth more meant in a place like this. When he finally heard the sound of approaching horses, something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't recognize. 2 of Garrett's men appeared, leading a single horse between them, and riding that horse, her hands bound in front of her and her head held high despite everything, was a woman who would change the trajectory of Silas Crane's life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. But he didn't know that yet. All he knew was that when they pulled her down from the horse, and she turned to face him for the first time, something inside him, something he thought had died a long time ago, suddenly woke up and started screaming. They dragged her toward the cage like she was cargo, not human. But Neil walked with her spine straight and her chin level, refusing to stumble, even though her bound hands threw off her balance. Silas stood 15 feet away, tried to maintain the detached posture of a man who'd done this kind of work before. He'd guarded prisoners. He'd transported criminals. He'd watched men hang and felt nothing. This should have been the same. It wasn't. The two men shoved Neil toward the open cage door. She turned before entering. And for the first time, Silas saw her face fully. The midday sun illuminated everything. The sharp angles of her cheekbones, the exhaustion around her eyes, the split in her lower lip where someone had struck her. But more than any of that, he saw something that made his stomach drop. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. Her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply stared at him with a look that said she saw exactly what he was. A man who traded his humanity for money. One of Garrett's men laughed. A wet, ugly sound. She's sizing you up, Crane, wondering if you're worth killing when she gets the chance. Silas didn't respond. He couldn't look away from her. Neil stepped into the cage without being pushed. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a death nail. The men locked it with a heavy chain and padlock, then tossed the key to Silas. He caught it reflexively. Good luck, one of them said, grinning. 3 days with. That one's going to feel like 3 years. They mounted their horses and disappeared through the narrow canyon passage, leaving Silas alone with his prisoner. The silence that followed was profound. Even the hawk had stopped. Circling, Silas forced himself to move, to do something practical. He checked the lock, confirmed it was secure. He walked the perimeter of the cage, looking for weaknesses in the iron bars, even though he knew there weren't any. He was stalling, and he knew it. Finally, he had no choice but to acknowledge her presence. He approached, the cage slowly, the key heavy in his pocket. Nall sat on the ground with her back against the far corner, her bound hands resting in her lap. She watched him approach with those same fierce eyes. I'm going to give you water, Silas said, hating how his voice sounded apologetic. Uncertain, he uncorked the canteen and held it. Through the bars, Neil didn't move. You need a drink. He tried again. It's going to get hotter. Still nothing. She just stared at him. And in that stare, Silas felt the full weight of what he'd become. He'd told himself for years that survival required compromises, that a man had to do what a man had to do to get by. That honor was a luxury for people who didn't know real hunger or real desperation. But standing there with that canteen in his hand, offering water to a woman in a cage that he was being paid to guard, Silas Crane felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Shame. He set the canteen just inside the bars where she could reach it, then stepped back. Neil's eyes followed him. After a long moment, she spoke. Her voice was rough from thirst, but clear, and her English was better than Garrett had claimed. You are not like them. 3 words shouldn't have carried so much weight. 3 words shouldn't have felt like an accusation, and an observation and a challenge all at once. Silas opened his mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but before he could find words, Nall continued, but you will be. By the time they return, you will be exactly like them. The certainty in her voice was worse than any insult. She didn't sound angry or hopeful. She sounded like she was stating a simple fact about how the world worked. And the worst part was until about 30 seconds ago, Silas would have agreed with her. Now he wasn't so sure, and that terrified him more than anything Garrett or his men could do. The afternoon heat settled into the canyon like something alive and suffocating. Silas sat in the shade of an overhanging rock 20 feet from the cage, trying to read the worn book he brought with him. The words blurred together. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Neil. She'd finally taken the water, drinking it carefully, making it last. Now she sat with her eyes closed, her breathing slow and measured. Silas wondered if she was sleeping or simply enduring. He wondered a lot of things he had no business wondering. The sound of approaching horses broke the silence earlier than expected. Silas stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip, but it was just two of Garrett's men, the ones who'd brought Neil earlier. They looked pleased with themselves in a way that made Silas's jaw tighten. Garrett wanted us to check in, the taller one said, dismounting. His name was Price, Silas remembered. Make sure you're handling everything all right. Everything's fine, Silas said flatly. Price walked closer to the cage, peering in at Neil with the expression of someone examining livestock. She giving you trouble? No. Good. That's good. Price pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Garrett wanted me to show you this. Figure you got a right to know what you're protecting. Silas took the paper, unfolding it slowly. It was a crudely printed notice, the kind posted in saloons and trading posts across the territory. The heading read, "Witness the savage Apache warrior woman." Below, that in smaller text, a description that made Silas's stomach turn. They were advertising her, not for a trial or a prisoner exchange. They were going to put her in traveling shows, charge people money to gawk at her like she was some kind of animal. Garrett's already got buyers interested. Price continued, oblivious to the way Silas's hands had started shaking. There's a man in Denver who runs exhibitions, pays top dollar for authentic specimens. Indians, outlaws, anybody with a good story. She'll tour the eastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, maybe even Washington. People eat this stuff up. Silas kept his voice level through sheer force of will. That why you grabbed her? For show business? Price shrugged. Money's money, and it ain't like she's got anywhere else to be. Her people, scattered to the wind after the raid. No family left, no tribe to go back to. This way at least she stays alive. That's more than most of them get. The casual cruelty of it hit Silas like a fist. He handed the paper back, not trusting himself to speak. Anyway, Price said, mounting his horse again, just wanted you to know what's at stake. She tries anything funny you remember. She's worth $500 in Denver. That's more than your cut for 3 days' work. Garrett's being generous letting you in on this at all. They rode off, leaving Silas holding information he wished he didn't have. He looked at Neil. Her eyes were open now, watching him. She'd heard everything he realized. Of course she had. Did you know? Her voice cut through the afternoon heat. Before you took this job, did you know what they planned? Silas should have lied. Should have said yes. Should have maintained the fiction that he was just like Garrett and his men. That money was money and conscience was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. No, I didn't know. And now that you do. She stood, moving to the bars. The afternoon sun caught the bruises on her arms, the cuts on her face, evidence of however they'd captured her. Will you still take their money? Silas looked at her. Really looked at her or not. As cargo or a prisoner or a job, but as a woman who'd had everything stolen from her and was now being told she'd spend the rest of her life in a cage for the entertainment of strangers. He thought about the $200 in his pocket when this was done. Thought about his failing ranch, the debts he owed, the life he was barely holding together. Thought about how easy it would be to just do the job and walk away. But when he opened his mouth to answer, he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that he didn't know what he was going to say. Night fell over the canyon in stages. First purple, then deep blue, then black, punctuated by stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Silas built a small fire, more for the light than the warmth. The desert held heat like a clenched fist, releasing it slowly into the darkness. Neil sat in the corner of the cage, her face half hidden in shadow. She hadn't spoken since asking him that question hours ago, the one he still hadn't answered. Silas couldn't stand the silence anymore. What did you do? The words came out rougher than he intended. To get caught. I mean, they said you were dangerous. Said you were a savage. Her voice was dry, almost amused. A killer. A threat to civilization. Something like that. She was quiet for so long that Silas thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Softer, tired. There was a settlement, small, 20 families, maybe. Less. They built their homes on land that my people used for winter hunting. We did not want war. We tried to move around them to share the space. She paused, and Silas heard her take a slow breath. But some men from that settlement, they decided we were the problem. They came to our camp one morning when most of the warriors were away. They came for the horses, they said. Just the horses. Silas felt his chest tighten. He knew how these stories ended. They took the horses, but then they saw the children, 7 of them, playing near the river. Her voice didn't waver, but Silas heard something underneath it. A grief so deep it had turned into stone. The men started laughing, making a game of it, chasing them, frightening them. I was there with 2 other women. We told them to stop. We begged them. They didn't stop, Silas said quietly. No, so I stopped them. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the darkness. I had a knife. Only a knife. I cut one of them across the arm when he grabbed a little girl by her hair. The others, they got angry, then said-eyed. Attacked them without cause, said I was wild, dangerous. They rode back to their settlement and returned with more men, with ropes and chains. The children, Silas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know what happened to them. They ran. I made sure they ran. There was satisfaction in her voice. Fierce and unashamed. That is what I did. That is why I am here. I defended children from men who thought terrorizing them was sport. Silas stared into the fire, watching the flames consume the dry wood. He thought about the notice Price had shown him, about Neil being paraded through cities as a curiosity, a savage warrior woman, about crowds paying to see her, to hear stories about how dangerous she was, how wild and unpredictable. Nobody would mention the children. Nobody would ask what those men were doing to make her attack. The story would be simplified, rewritten, made palatable for audiences who wanted to feel justified in their fear of people like her. Garrett and his men, Neil continued. They found me 2 days later. I was trying to reach the mountains where other families had fled. They tracked me like an animal. When they caught me, Garrett said I was worth money because of what I'd done. Because people would pay to see the savage who attacked innocent settlers. That's not what happened, Silas said. No, but that is what they will say happened. And who will people believe? Garrett with his printed notices and his respectable clothes, or me, the dangerous Apache woman in a cage? Silas had no answer for that because they both knew the truth. He'd seen it happen before. Stories twisted until the victims became villains and the villains became heroes. He stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the anger building in his chest. He walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out at the darkness beyond. Behind him, he heard Neil shift. In the cage. You did not answer my question, she said. Now that you know what they plan, will you still take their money? Silas turned to face her. The fire cast shadows across the bars of the cage, making it look like she was already behind the walls of whatever exhibition hall they'd sell her to. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm starting to think that might be the most honest answer I've given anyone in a long time. In the darkness beyond the canyon walls, horses were approaching, not from the direction Garrett had left, but from somewhere else entirely. Silas had his revolver drawn before the riders cleared the narrow passage into the canyon. 3 horses. He recognized them. Immediately, Garrett and 2 of his men returning a full day early. Something had changed. Garrett dismounted with the heavy movements of a man who'd been drinking. The smell of whiskey preceded him as he walked toward the fire, his eyes glassy and unfocused. The 2 men with him looked uneasy, like they'd tried to talk him out of something and failed. Crane, Garrett said, his voice thick. How's our merchandise? Quiet. No problems. Silas kept his tone neutral, but his grip tightened on the revolver still in his hand. Garrett laughed, a wet sound that made Silas's skin crawl. That's good. That's real good because I got news. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, different from the one Price had shown earlier. Got a telegram. Buyer in Denver wants Her moved up. Wants her there in 4 days instead of 2 weeks. Says he'll pay double if we can deliver early. For days. Isn't much time, Silas said carefully. Which is why we're leaving tonight. Right now. Garrett walked toward the cage, swaying slightly. Wanted to come back. Make sure she was ready to travel. Can't have damaged goods, you understand? Neil stood as Garrett approached, her body tense, but her face expressionless. She'd learned Silas. Realized how to hide fear behind a mask of indifference. The thought made him sick. Garrett grabbed the bars of the cage, leaning close. You hear that, savage? You're going to be famous. People are going to pay good money to see you. The wild Apache woman who attacked innocent men. He laughed again. Hell, maybe they'll let people poke you. With sticks. Make it interactive, Garrett. One of his men said nervously. Maybe we should just load her up and shut up. Garrett pulled a flask from his pocket, taking a long drink. Then he did. Something that made Silas's blood turn to ice. He pulled his knife from his belt and dragged it across the bars, the metal shrieking. You know what? I think she needs to understand her situation better. Needs to know what happens to Indians who think they're better than that's enough. Silas's voice cut through the night like a blade. Garrett turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. What did you say? I said that's enough. You hire me to guard her. Part of that job is making sure she arrives undamaged. You start cutting on her now. You decrease her value. It was a calculated risk, appealing to Garrett's greed rather than his humanity. For a moment, Silas thought it might work. Then Garrett's face twisted into something ugly. You telling me how to run my business, Crane? I'm telling you that you're drunk and about to make a mistake that costs you money. The two other men shifted nervously, hands moving toward their weapons. The canyon suddenly felt very small, the walls closing in. Silas was outnumbered and outgunned, and everyone knew it. Garrett took a step towards Silas, his knife still in his hand. You know what I think? I think you've been out here too long with her. I think she's been getting into your head just like I warned you, making you soft. I'm thinking about profit. Silas. Leet. That's all. No. Garrett was close enough now that Silas could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes. Smell. The whiskey on his breath. You're thinking about being a hero, about doing the right thing. And you know what happens to heroes out here, Crane? They die poor and stupid. Garrett turned back toward the cage, raising the knife. Now, I'm going to teach this savage a lesson about respect, and you're going to stand there and watch. And if you got a problem with that, we can settle it right now. Silas looked past Garrett to where Neil stood behind the bars. She wasn't looking at Garrett or the knife. She was looking at Silas, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his decision for him. Not fear or hope or expectation, just acknowledgement. She knew what was about to happen, had probably seen it happen before. She was simply bearing witness to who Silas Crane really was. The moment stretched out, thin as wire. Then Silas did something that would cost him everything. No, he said quietly. We're not doing this. And he raised his revolver, pointing it directly at Garrett's chest. Time crystallized into something sharp and breakable. For men, with weapons, all calculating angles and odds. The fire crackled. A horse stamped. Nervously. Nobody breathed. Garrett's face went through several expressions. Surprise, rage, calculation before settling on something cold and dangerous. You're making a mistake, Crane. Probably. Silas kept the revolver steady, but I'm making it anyway. Put the knife down and back away from the cage. You can't shoot all three of us. One of Garrett's men said, his hand hovering near his holster. No, Silas. Agreed. But I can definitely shoot him, and I will if anyone reaches for a weapon. Garrett's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. You know what you're throwing away? $200. Clean record. Your reputation for what? Some Apache woman who'd cut your throat if she got the chance. Maybe. Silas glanced quickly at Null, then back to Garrett. But at least I'll be able to sleep at night. You think you're noble? Garrett's laugh was bitter. You think this changes anything? There are 100 men like me, 200 a 1,000. You save her tonight, and someone else catches her tomorrow. You can't fix this, Crane. You can't fix any of it. I know. And that was the terrible truth of it. Silas knew that saving one woman wouldn't change the world, wouldn't stop what was happening to her people, wouldn't make him anything other than a failed rancher with a death wish. But I can fix what's happening right here, right now. That's enough. Garrett stared at him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. Fine. You want to die for her? That's your choice. He turned to his men. Mount up. We'll deal with this in the morning when he's tired and stupid. Garrett, one of them, started. I said, mount up. Garrett shoved his knife back into his belt. Crane's not going anywhere. Neither is she. And when the sun comes up, we'll come back with more men and more weapons, and we'll see how noble he feels then. The three men backed toward their horses, weapons still holstered, but hands ready. Garrett climbed into his saddle, his eyes never leaving Silas. You're a dead man, Crane. You know that, right? Been dead for a while. Silas said, just didn't know it until tonight. They rode out, disappearing, into the darkness beyond the canyon. But Silas knew they wouldn't go far. They'd camp just outside, wait for him to lower his guard or fall asleep. Come dawn, they'd come back ready for a fight, which meant he had maybe 6 hours to make this right. Silas lowered his revolver, his hands shaking from adrenaline. He turned to find Neil gripping the bars of the cage, her eyes wide. Why? She asked. Why did you do that? Silas pulled the key from his pocket, walking toward the cage. Because you were right. I wasn't like them. He fitted the key into the lock. But I was going to be, and I couldn't live with that. The lock clicked open. The chain rattled. As it fell away, Silas pulled the door wide, the hinges protesting with a sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet canyon. Neil stood frozen in the entrance like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Silas understood the feeling. He couldn't quite believe it either. You need to run, he said, moving to where the horses were tethered. I'll give you one of the horses, whatever supplies I can spare. Head north into the mountains. Don't stop until they will kill you. It wasn't a question. Probably. Silas started gathering supplies. Canteen, dried meat, a blanket. But that's not your problem anymore. You're letting me go, she said, it like she was testing the reality of the words. After everything, even though it cost you your life, Silas handed her the supplies, then pulled his knife from his belt and cut the ropes binding her wrists. The skin underneath was raw and bleeding. When I saw you standing in that cage, I saw what I'd become, what I'd let myself become. This isn't about saving you. It's about saving whatever's left of me. Neil rubbed her freed wrists, staring at him with an intensity that made him look away. Then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand briefly on his arm, just a touch, barely a second, before moving toward the horses. But in that moment, Silas Crane understood something he'd forgotten a long time ago, that doing the right thing didn't require hope for a better outcome. It just required doing it anyway. Neil mounted the horse with the fluid grace of someone who'd been riding before she could walk. Silas handed her the supplies, then his spare revolver, a gesture that left him with only one weapon against 3 armed men. There's a trail north, he said, pointing toward the far end of the canyon. Follows the ridge line for about 5 miles, then splits. Take the eastern fork. It'll bring you to the river valley. From there, you can lose yourself in the mountains. She checked the revolver with practiced hands, confirming it was loaded. You have done this before. Help people run. It wasn't a question, but Silas answered anyway. A long time ago, before I decided survival mattered more than conscience. And now I'm remembering why I made that choice in the first place. He glanced toward the canyon entrance where Garrett and his men had disappeared. They'll hear the horse. You need to ride hard and don't look back. I'll buy you whatever time I can. Nal studied him for a long moment. You will die for this probably. Silas found himself smiling despite everything. But I've been dying slowly for years. At least this way means something. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and something close to respect. Then she spoke words that hit Silas harder than any bullet could. My people have a belief that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. You have that courage, Silas Crane, and that is worth more than any life lived in cowardice. Before he could respond, she kicked the horse into motion, disappearing through the narrow passage at the far end of the canyon. The sound of hooves on stone echoed briefly, then faded into silence. Silas stood alone beside the open cage, his heart pounding. He had maybe 20 minutes before Garrett realized what was happening. 20 minutes to prepare for what came next. He worked quickly, reloading his revolver and positioning himself behind a large boulder that offered cover while giving him a clear line of sight to the main canyon entrance. He gathered the remaining water, knowing that if this became a siege, he'd need every advantage. The empty cage stood like an accusation in the firelight, its doors swinging gently. In a night breeze, the 20 minutes felt like 20 seconds. Garrett and his men came fast and loud, abandoning any pretense of waiting until dawn. They must have heard the horse, realized what was happening. Their shouts echoed off the canyon walls as they rode in, weapons already drawn. Crane, Garrett's voice was raw with fury. "Where is she?" Silas stepped out from behind the boulder, his revolver raised. "Gone, and you're not getting her back." The three men spread out, forming a semicircle. In the firelight, Garrett's face was twisted with rage. "You stupid, stupid man. You really think one person can change anything? She's Apache. Someone will catch her. Someone always does." "Maybe," Silas said calmly. "But it won't be you." "Kill him," Garrett ordered. The canyon erupted in violence. Silas fired first, his bullet catching one of Garrett's men in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse. Return fire exploded from multiple directions, bullets ricocheting off stone with sounds like angry hornets. "Sidas dove." Behind the boulder, as chunks of rock exploded near his head. He fired twice more, forcing Garrett and the remaining man to take cover. But he was pinned down now, outnumbered and outpositioned. His only advantage was knowing the canyon better than they did. 3 days of watching and waiting had taught him every shadow, every angle. A bullet struck the boulder inches from his face, spraying rock dust into his eyes. Silas blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. When he looked again, Garrett had flanked to the left, moving through the shadows toward a position that would give him a clear shot. Silas made a choice. He broke from cover, running toward the far side of the canyon, where a narrow crevice offered temporary protection. Bullets followed him, one grazing his left arm with a line of fire. He felt blood, but kept moving. From his new position, he could see all three men. The wounded one was down, but still conscious. Garrett and the other man were advancing, using the cage itself as cover. The irony wasn't lost on Silas. The cage that had held Neil was now protecting the men who'd imprisoned her. He fired his last 2 bullets, forcing them back, buying himself seconds he didn't have. Then his revolver clicked empty. Garrett heard. It smiled. "It's over, Crane." Silas reached for his knife, the only weapon he had left. Through the chaos and the fear and the certainty of death, one thought burned clear. Neil was free. Whatever happened next, she was free, and that made everything worth it. Garrett advanced slowly, his revolver trained on Silas's chest. The other man circled right, cutting off any escape route. Silas gripped his knife, knowing it was useless against bullets, but refusing to die without it in his hand. "You know what's funny?" Garrett said, stopping 15 feet away. "All this, and it doesn't matter. We'll find her, track her down, and when we do, I'll make sure she knows what it cost you. Make sure she understands that your sacrifice was for nothing. You won't find her." Silas's voice was steady despite the pain in his arm, despite knowing these were likely his last words. "She knows this land. You don't. By the time you figure out which direction she went, she'll be days ahead of you. And your buyer in Denver, he's going to be real disappointed when you show up empty-handed." Something flickered in Garrett's eyes. Doubt, or maybe just rage at the truth of it. Then, from somewhere beyond the canyon came a sound that changed everything. Horses. Multiple horses moving fast. Garrett's head snapped toward the canyon entrance. "Who?" A voice cut through the darkness amplified by the canyon walls. "This is Marshal Webb. Drop your weapons. All of you." 6 riders entered the canyon, their badges catching the firelight. A marshal and his deputies drawn by the gunfire that had echoed across the desert. Silas felt something like relief flood through him, followed immediately by bitter understanding. The law had arrived, but out here the law rarely sided with men who freed Apache prisoners. Marshal Webb dismounted a weathered man in his 50s with eyes that had seen too much. He surveyed the scene. The open cage, the wounded man, the weapons, the blood. His gaze settled on Silas. "Somebody want to tell me what's happening here?" Garrett holstered his weapon smoothly, his face transforming into something reasonable and wronged. "Marshal, thank God you're here. This man, Crane, he's a criminal. We hired him to guard a prisoner and he let her escape, stole one of our horses. When we tried to stop him, he opened fire on us." Webb looked at Silas. "That true?" Silas could have lied, could have created a story that made him look better, but he'd spent too many years lying to himself to start lying to others now. "I'll let her go." The woman they had caged. She was being held illegally. They planned to sell her for exhibition shows in the East. "She's Apache," Garrett interrupted. "A savage who attacked settlers. We had every right to detain her, and she defended children," Silas said, his voice cutting through Garrett's lies. "Your men chased Apache children like animals. She stopped them. That's what she did." Webb studied both men for a long moment. Then he turned to Garrett. "You got papers for this? Prisoner? Legal authority to hold her?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "We don't need papers for yeah. You do." Webb's voice went hard. "In exhibitions selling people for shows. That's human trafficking. Hollis, I've been looking for an excuse to bring you in for months. Looks like I finally got it." The world tilted sideways. Silas had expected arrest, trial, maybe hanging. He hadn't expected this. Webb's deputies moved forward, collecting weapons from Garrett and his men. The wounded man was helped onto a horse, groaning. Garrett's face had gone pale with contained fury. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," Garrett said. "That woman is dangerous." She's gone," Webb interrupted. "And good riddance. As for you, you're facing charges, trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, assault. You'll answer for all of it." Webb turned to Silas. "As for you, Crane, can't say I approve of your methods, but I'll take freeing a woman over caging her any day." He gestured to the blood on Silas's arm. "Get that looked at, then get out of here before I change my mind about charging you with something." 3 hours later, Silas sat on a ridge overlooking the canyon, watching the sun rise over the desert. His arm was bandaged, his horse was gone, and his pockets were as empty as they'd been. When this started, Garrett and his men were in custody, heading for trial. The cage stood empty, its doors still open. Silas didn't know where Neil was, whether she'd found her people, whether she was safe. He'd probably never know, but somewhere out there, she was free. And for the first time in years, so was he. The man who'd accepted money to guard a cage was gone. What remained was someone who'd remembered at the last possible moment that some things mattered more than survival. Some things mattered more than money or safety or even life itself. Silas Crane stood wincing at the pain in his arm and started walking. He had no destination, no plan, no prospects, but he had something he'd lost a long time ago. He had himself back, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and conscience collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like these. Your support means everything to us.